Despite promising to close down the prison at Guantanamo in his first year in office, and despite putting on hold military trials there, President Barack Obama resumed the military commissions at Guantanamo in March. And yes, that means the prison at Guantanamo is still open. Advocates for Guantanamo as a prison for suspected terrorists have said from the beginning that America needs Guantanamo. America needs Guantanamo because Guantanamo can do something for us that no other place and no other prison or court system could do. That hypothesis has become muddled at best over the years, and it's now the most muddled it's ever been after a cache of more than 700 classified documents from the Bush era was released and posted online last night. The documents, originally obtained by WikiLeaks, are assessments of Guantanamo prisoners made between 2002 and 2009. These assessments look at prisoners' health, whether or not these prisoners still pose a danger to the United States, whether or not they have any value as an intelligence asset. What's mainly revealed by these new documents is just how imprecise and chaotic the entire detention and trial system was and has been over time. Just taking one case as an example. One case, a prisoner originally from Germany was deemed to be a high risk. His file said he was likely to be a threat to the United States. His prisoner file recommended that the man remain incarcerated at the prison, that his detention continue, that the high risk to America, who is also supposedly still a moderately good source of intelligence, that guy should be kept in prison. That guy was released 3 months after the assessment was made. He was sent back to Germany, where Der Spiegel reports he bought a sports car and published a book before retreating to relative obscurity. Also, take the case of a Sudanese cameraman for Al Jazeera. He was held for 6 years at Guantanamo, in part because of his value as an intelligence source about Al Jazeera, about Al Jazeera's inner workings as a media operation. He was released 3 years ago and went back to work at Al Jazeera. Another prisoner was held for what he knew about personalities in the Bahraini court, like the Bahraini royals. Another was in prison so military intelligence could find out what he knew of the Secret Service in Uzbekistan. The leaked documents also include guidelines for interrogators, guidelines about what to look for when assessing a prisoner. These included observing a prisoner's reaction to the Star-Spangled Banner, whether or not they expressed support for other prisoners who had committed suicide at Guantanamo. And also, I kid you not, whether or not the prisoner had been found with a certain model of Casio watch that also happens to be owned by a certain cable news host. That's really embarrassing. With a pile of new data this big, making clear sense of the meaning is difficult. But the meaning that's hardest to find at this point is the meaning of what exactly Guantanamo Bay provides us as a country that is so important, that it can't be done by any other means. It can't be done by any other institution. Why we've still got this place open and what its value is to us. Joining us now is Charlie Savage. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2007 for his coverage of presidential signing statements. And he, over the weekend, was one of the New York Times reporters who brought us this WikiLeaked information on Guantanamo, although the Times did not get the information from WikiLeaks. Mr. Savage, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
Let me ask you if I got anything wrong there in the introduction. This is a massive cache of documents, and I sometimes felt like I was getting lost in the details, like I was reading a novel.
It is an absolutely enormous trove, just like previous WikiLeaks caches have been. And what's been true before is true here as well, which is just it's an overwhelming amount of information, but it tends to be granular details of information rather than broad new headlines of things that we never suspected before or never saw before. And one of the aspects of that is that you can mine this pile of documents for basically anything you want to find. You can cherry pick it, the documents to find incredibly innocent people who were brought there by mistake and should never have been brought there and were rated high risk and were sent back and have lived quiet lives. And you can also mine it to find people who are genuinely scary or who were fooled their interrogators and got out and went on to become suicide bombers. And so I think one of the things that's hard to predict about the release of this information is whether it will actually change anything or whether it will instead just sort of ratchet up the argument where each side will find new ammunition to fling at the other about the Guantanamo prison as it increasingly looks like a permanent institution in the United States government.
One of the things that seemed so interesting to me was something that you could glean from the interrelationship of these documents. The number of times that individual prisoner sources were cited as giving information about other prisoners.
That's right.
The way that information was used so intensively, even by some sources that had, in other circumstances, had doubts cast on its veracity. What do you think that explains about how Guantanamo works?
Well, Guantanamo, whether you like Guantanamo or you don't like it, one of the things that occurs to one as you're working through these documents is how hard it must have been for the analysts down there to make sense of all these people that the military was shipping to Cuba out of the battlefield and the AFPAC border, and to try to figure out what was true about these people, who they really were, what they had done before they had been captured, and how risky it would be to let them go. They've very often had very little information to work with other than what other detainees at Guantanamo were saying about them, people who were captured with them or who said that they had seen them at such and such training camp or fighting in Tora Bora or in the presence of a Qaeda figure or so forth. That was often most of what they had. And yes, you're right that there are some detainees, half a dozen or so, that show up all over the place, basically in jailhouse informants who were spilling their guts, and some of them had mental problems, some of them had agendas. On the other hand, it's also possible perhaps to make too much of that, in that often, you would have this one guy who's suspect who's saying such and such about a prisoner, but 7 or 8 other people are also saying that thing. So is this a tainted assessment because this one guy's tainted, or is that irrelevant? This is part of the complexity of Guantanamo. Anything you look at it very hard for a while, the black and whiteness sort of drains away.
In terms of the purpose of Guantanamo, what you just described there in terms of trying to figure out what is important and valuable to know about these people who we have held there. I think the main conceptual problem I have always had about Guantanamo is that I have never understood the means by which they are trying to get that information. By what means are they trying to nail those things down? And if it is sort of mutual corroboration is a lot of the stuff that they're looking for, it does seem clear that it can never really be, the people's detention at Guantanamo can never really be linked to a robust court system. It's not a good means of eliciting evidence to just ask other prisoners about their cellmates, right?
It's certainly true that a lot of the evidence that in an intelligence context, the intelligence community, the military said, this is good enough for us, this guy's a combatant, we're going to hold him, would never stand up in a court, be it a military commission or a regular, traditional Article III court. This is sort of a very different standard for how you decide what is true and what's the tipping point where you decide that something is good enough that you can reach a conclusion. A lot of this people here, that kind of information just cannot stand up in court. And in fact, we've seen in the habeas corpus lawsuits, several dozen cases where judges have said, I don't believe this witness, I don't believe that witness.
Charlie Savage, Pulitzer Prize winner, reporter for the New York Times. Thank you for your incredible legwork on getting through all this and for your time tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Just a heads up for anybody appearing on television. All conversations which are shot on videotape are recorded on videotape, which documents those conversations, every word. Mr. Blagojevich, you did know that, right? Senator McCain, Senator Graham, public record? That's coming up.